Iron Maiden. There's not a whole lot that can be said about this powerhouse group that hasn't been said. Out of all the bands that emerged from the new wave of British heavy metal, Maiden is probably the most famous, ever since their creation in 1975 by bassist Steve Harris and guitarist Dave Murray, and the eventual recruitment of vocalist Paul Di'Anno. Maiden showed great potential with their first two albums, the self-titled debut album, and Killers. However, when the 80s rolled around, Iron Maiden struck gold. Another guitarist by the name of Adrian Smith joined their ranks. As well, vocalist Paul Di'Anno was replaced by the now legendary Bruce Dickinson, one of the most famous singers in heavy metal history. Dickinson's operatic and powerful vocal style, combined with Murray and Smith's epic guitar skills, had elevated Maiden to a superstar status in the musical world. With albums like Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Power Slave, and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, Maiden instantly became a musical juggernaut, loved and respected even by thousands of people who didn't even like heavy metal, and almost single-handedly made the metal genre more popular in the 80s than any other genre that existed. Even though the albums I mentioned are Paramount Records, there is one I didn't mention that will be the subject of today's review. And that album is 1986's Somewhere in Time. God, what an incredible album. But also a very overlooked album. But for a legitimate reason. Somewhere in Time was released in between two of the most critically praised records that Maiden had released, 1984's Power Slave and 1988's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. So it's little wonder why Somewhere in Time is hardly mentioned by even the most hardcore Maiden fans. But to actually talk about the record itself, like Judas Priest before them, Maiden decided to upgrade their sound to make their guitars sound much more electric and sci-fi to better fit within the power metal genre, in a much similar way to Judas Priest with Ram It Down. But this album was much better received. Speaking of which, the reason why I've chosen to review this album is because, while it is definitely an album that people have heard of, it is also an album that people actually rarely talk about. When you discuss Iron Maiden with some random guy, the first records that instantly pop into their head mostly consist of stuff like Number of the Beast, Power Slave, Peace of Mind, Fear of the Dark, or Seventh Son of the Seventh Son. But those are really some of the most monumental Maiden records ever. Here and there, you'll have a guy who remembers Killers and the Di'Anno years in general, or a guy who likes some more recent stuff like Brave New World or Dance of Death. But never have I met someone who actually mentioned Caught Somewhere in Time by name. And as paramount as this record was to the development of Maiden's sound, that doesn't really sit well with me. I've heard people mention a couple songs from the record, like Wasted Years and Stranger in a Strange Land, but nothing more beyond that. Now, actually talking about the album itself, it was released in 1986, a year that was a nuclear explosion of both debut heavy metal albums and albums released by veteran bands. Introduced bands like King Diamond, Atrophy, Primus, and huge records by already existing bands: Ozzy Osbourne, Van Halen, Motorhead, Creator, Dio. You had three iconic albums from three of the big four thrash metal bands. You had Slayer's Rain and Blood, Megadeth's Peace Sells, and last but absolutely not least, Metallica's Master of Puppets. And let's not forget that '86 was the year when Europe started their final countdown. Now, why did I just talk about all those guys? Because I wanted to show the type of competition that this album was up against. Like Ram It Down, comparing it to most of the albums I just mentioned would be a fool's errand. But it's still a damn great record on its own. The high-tech, power-enhanced guitars really brings all the rest of the instruments up to a level where it matches the volume of Bruce Dickinson's voice. Which reminds me of another thing. Now, I'll go on record in saying I love Bruce Dickinson, so don't get me wrong when I say this. But I wasn't that crazy about his voice in the albums before this one. The only reason for this is because his voice was so loud that it almost obscured the guitars and drums in the background. Dave Murray's guitar playing I really felt was sometimes overshadowed by Dickinson's voice. Now, that could be attributed to any number of reasons. Maybe the sound mixing equipment for the previous albums wasn't up to par, or maybe their equipment just wasn't all that adjusted or well tuned. But whatever the problems were, they managed to fix them with this album. Dickinson does not overshadow anybody. In fact, I'd say that Dickinson's vocals are not as prominent as they were in the previous albums. And you know what? I love that. Because Dave Murray is such an incredible guitarist that he would give KK Downing, Zakk Wylde, and Randy Rhoads a run for their money all at the same time. These solos that are on this record are probably some of, if not, the greatest collection of guitar solos I've ever heard from a single album. That's not to say Bruce's voice work is not as stellar here as it was in the previous CDs, but honestly, there's nothing I can say about Bruce that everyone else has not said. But here, his voice just kind of blends into the background a little bit. Before, Bruce's voice was the tip of the spear in the Iron Maiden sound-making machine. But now with this album, it's on completely equal ground with all the other instruments, and that's why this album is so damn great. Personal favorite songs from the record, for me anyways, are The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, Deja Vu, Caught Somewhere in Time, Stranger in a Strange Land, Wasted Years, and Alexander the Great. And you know something? That's more than half of the whole album, so really, if I'm recommending over half of the entire album, then you know that you have to check this CD out. And for all the Iron Maiden fans out there who never got to check out this record, it is absolutely worth checking out. This is a quintessential Iron Maiden album that represents when their sound was perfected and their style was absolute. And it's also an important piece of history for Maiden. So, Somewhere in Time, consider yourself recommended. I'm F.W. Waller, and as always, thank you for watching.